So in January 22, on the 7th of January, I had my son. He was, I don't know if this is part of the story or whether it should be part of the story, I'm not sure, but he was induced because he was measuring quite big. And it was a tricky labour. I ended up having a episiotomy with him, and he was 9 pounds, so he was quite a big baby. And we went home 24 hours later, everything was fine. He struggled with feeding in those early days. In the first week, he'd lost 13% of his birth weight, which I believe if they go over, they have to then go back into hospital. But we were put on a feeding plan where he would have a bit of breast milk, and then he would be topped up with a bottle. And I would then have to top up my milk supply with pumping as well. And that was the first sort of seven to 10 days at home. I think actually, sorry, one key thing I've really missed there is day 2, I think they call it, going into day 3, which is when your milk supply comes in. I was breastfeeding him and my nipples started bleeding. It was excruciating pain. It was almost like he'd bitten down on it. And they started bleeding, and I phoned the hospital and said, is this okay? Is this normal? And they said, yeah, that's absolutely normal. If your other breast isn't bleeding, then put him on that one. So I did. And again, exactly the same thing happened. And so I guess from day 3, when my milk came in, it was absolute agony feeding him, because I was feeding through, I guess, cuts. And I was using a nipple shield to protect myself. And again, just battling with the fact that he needed to have be topped up with feeding as well. And so it was sort of a blur in those 10 days, really, of just muddling through sleepless nights, a baby who was not necessarily feeding right, or he was bringing my milk down, they believe, and then not taking it. His latch was fine. The midwives were very happy with his latch. And it was a blur. It was an absolute blur, in all honesty. And day 10, we got to a point, probably, I think it was the day before, on day 9, we'd gotten to a point where I felt like we had cracked it. The pain started to go. He started feeding continuously and not just bringing the milk down and then pulling off and messing around. It started to just feel how it should feel, basically. And that was a good day. That was a really good day. And then the following day, day 10, I woke up with my body aching everywhere, a temperature. My left breast was in agony. It was raw, it was hot, it was really painful, and I had a rash started to appear. And I remember my husband waking me up saying, you need to feed Rex, our son. And I just said, I don't think I can do this. I just need to just continue sleeping. Maybe can you give him a bottle for this feed? I just need to sleep off and we'll see how we get on with the next one. So he let me go back to sleep. And again, I woke up and I didn't feel any better. By that point, the rash had started to grow. And my temperature was quite high at that point. I think it was probably about 40 degrees. So we got on the phone straight away to the midwives, and we said that it could potentially be mastitis, but Louise is not very well, basically. And because I had an episiotomy, the midwives called us in straight away and said, we just need to check you out to just make sure there's an infection not going on with your stitches. So we went into the hospital. So we saw an obstetrician. We were there all day. The obstetrician, I just remember, again, feeding through the pain. That's the advice that you're giving on the NHS website, through any doctors, through any breastfeeding or lactation consultants you speak to. It's just feed through mastitis. And I remember he sat in hospital. My husband had him on him the whole day until I needed to feed him. And it was sort of just doing hypnobirthing techniques when I needed to feed on that breast. The right breast was okay at that point, actually. And then when the doctor saw us towards the end of the day, they said, yeah, you've you've got mastitis, here we go, have some antibiotics and go back home. So we went back home, and on the way home, I just felt like I was getting worse. I was sick in the car on the way home. We got back to the hospital. Sorry, got back to our home. I came upstairs to bed, and I was again sick, sick several times. And I actually really can't necessarily remember that stage, other than just being so severely ill. I almost thought I was dying, and having to keep feeding through it as well. I just remember having to sort of put my head into such a positive mind frame and do hypnobirthing techniques before my husband gave me my son, and then he'd take him away after he'd been fed and let me sleep because I was just so drowsy, and we were trying to still establish that feeding. And so he'd just wake me up to feed him, and I would have to sort of really get into the mindset and then feed him and then go back to sleep. And I text my mum and just said, look, Mum, if there's any chance that you might be able to help, I think we really need it. I'm really, really, really poorly. And then the next day, I don't think she quite fully understood to the extent of how bad it was until the next day when she came and saw us. And then she sort of, by that point, actually, the rash was not just on my left breast anymore, but it was also on my right breast and starting to creep up into my chest, around to the sides, underneath my armpits, of which this was a Wednesday. And I had taken the antibiotics for 24 hours. My temperature was still running at 40 degrees plus. Basically, it wasn't going down on paracetamol or ibuprofen. And I was a blur. It was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Just knowing that I had to feed my son, you know, I didn't want to start associating him with negative feelings or pain as well. And I remember contacting my NCT counsellor and said, you know, what should I do? And my mum said to me, she remembers vividly that the NCT counsellor sort of said, just aim their nose towards the red rash on your breast, because that's where the infection is. So they just need to bring the milk from down there. And actually, I was just one mass of redness all over my breasts, actually. So that I couldn't do that. And my mum stayed that night, and then we had a visit from the midwife on Thursday morning. So it was 48 hours from our first visit to the hospital. And she came upstairs to do a routine check, and I'd had paracetamol 2-3 hours previous with ibuprofen again. It was 48 hours on antibiotics, and the redness was sort of starting to creep up around my neck. I was going around to the edges of my back. And my temperature hadn't gone down. I think it was running at about 41 at that point. And she got straight on the phone to the hospital. And I was admitted to hospital that day. My husband took me in. And as soon as we got to hospital, I remember saying at this point that I couldn't breastfeed any longer. I'd done 48 hours through this. I was in absolutely agony, and in all honesty, and I still stand by this, it was far more painful than childbirth. And it was horrendous. It was very tough, very tough. And so they wanted me to keep pumping. They took all the markers, they started measuring the marks as well for the redness. So I had biro all on me at this point. At this point, I was in the maternal assessment unit, so just before you go into labour where you're assessed. So there was women there who were in labour, and I was in there 10 days or 12 days after having my child, and still using those hypnobirthing techniques to start pumping. The pain I can't even begin to describe. I was then admitted into hospital and taken up onto the ward. And sort of from that point on was a blur, if I'm honest. My husband went home that night, And I don't think he fully understood to the extent of how poorly I was. We didn't get told what was going on. And I just remember just being woken up every hour by doctors assessing me, taking bloods, taking urine samples, taking my temperature, just doing all the observations that they needed to, making sure I was still alive, I think, maybe. I remember them saying, one of them, I had sort of the, my obs were the same level as like a geriatric or something. I just couldn't move, couldn't look at the light. And what the hardest thing was is that my son was still with us, because when I was admitted, technically I was still breastfeeding. And so I had to still feed my son, who at 12 days old, you know, is feeding every 2-3 hours. And during that night, I couldn't hold him, actually. It had gotten to the point sort of 2 days before, on that Tuesday when I was first admitted, I couldn't hold him because I was in so much agony with my breasts, and I still couldn't hold him at that point. And so I had to lie him on the bed and feed him with a bottle, because I couldn't pick him up, and then I had to call the midwives to then come and pick him up and put him back in the cot. I couldn't even hold myself up, let alone hold him up. It was a blur. It was a complete and utter blur, and it was survival. I have to say, I think it was survival to get through that aspect of it. And then I was sent off for MRI scans, X-rays as well, and told to still keep pumping, which I did. And we got to a point, by this point, I think we were 4 days in, it was a Friday. My milk I wasn't producing milk. I was producing what I can describe as looking like Lucozade. It was clear, bright yellow. I don't know what it was. I don't think they even knew what it was. And if I'm honest, I don't think anyone really knew what was happening. I don't think it necessarily occurred to anybody at that point in time that it was sepsis, because, I mean, they were still treating it as mastitis. They sent me, when I said to them, I'm sorry, but I can't pump anymore, it got so painful on that Friday that I asked to take morphine, because I couldn't deal with the pain. And I don't like morphine. I didn't have it during labor. And so when I took it, I became delusional. And all I remember is saying, I can't do this. I absolutely can't do this anymore. I can't feed, I can't pump, I just cannot go on. And I sort of remember putting my foot down with the poor midwife, at which that point they then brought in a lactation consultant and said, well, why don't you speak with one of the lactation consultants first? And so I sat in a bath, and she was pouring warm water on my breasts. They were scabbed, they were cut, they were swollen, they were red. I had biro all over me. And I think she couldn't really believe to the extent where we were, and how we'd gotten there. But she was sort of giving me some advice how we can pick it up. And I just thought, I really can't pick it up. I have to stop. I absolutely have to stop. So I slept on it that night. Again, it was one of those nights. By that point, my husband was allowed to stay in hospital with me to support me with feeding, or he mostly took over the feeding. And I, again, was being observed every hour. And we were in a private room at that point. And then, yeah, I think from that point, again, it was just, I had stopped feeding, pumping. But it was just an utter blur of, I was hallucinating. I could feel my mental health spiraling out of control. My temperature was still sitting at 41. Yeah, it was just one big mess, basically. And it took a few days because over the weekend things go quiet. And it took a few days, and an obstetrician who really wanted, because every day they sent in a new obstetrician to find out what was going on, and none of the meds that they were giving me were working. And I think I was on about 5 different of antibiotics at that point. And what do they call it? Intravenous, that was it. So I had loads of IVs in me. It was at one point, it was sort of just, I was there on IV throughout the entire day. And I think it was about the Monday or Tuesday, and the obstetrician, there was an obstetrician who came in, and she was really lovely. And it was getting to a point that it had been a week now, and I hadn't held my son without it being painful. And I think I think I struck a chord with her, and she really wanted to get to the bottom of what this was. And the breast clinic then got involved as well. And I had a ultrasound, and they found loads of cellulitis and liquid and fluid around my breasts and my back and my chests and my neck and my armpits, all of this area basically, all of the top half of my torso. And from that point on, I was being treated for sepsis. And then really from that point onwards, it wasn't until 5 days later that I then was discharged. So from that point, it sort of then did improve quite dramatically. And yeah, it was, I don't know if we really knew it was sepsis actually. I don't think we weren't told at that point. When you're maternal or postnatal, you've got your notes, you've got your maternal notes. And it wasn't until my husband was looking through my notes that he saw the medication that I was being given, and it was all the medication for sepsis. My sister-in-law works in the NHS, she's a physio, and so he was just on the phone to her going, what's this mean and what's this? And she was sort of advising him any medical terms, and that is for this sepsis, and they're doing this because of that. And no one had communicated that to us, and I still to this day don't really know why. I don't know if it was to give us the strength that we've got to get through this, basically. But we had a debrief 3 months afterwards, and it answered lots of questions. But equally, I think that the maternal team where we were based were equally gobsmacked and shocked, actually, at the extent of how quickly what seemed to be of mastitis has escalated all the way through to sepsis. And even to this day, I'm still not 100% sure if it was mastitis and whether it actually was the infection that happened through the cracked nipples. So yeah, I still don't necessarily have all the answers. But as a result of that experience, I then had PTSD. I ended up getting PND, really struggled with my mental health in those first few days and weeks. I was going back to the hospital every single week after I was discharged as an inpatient. I had to go back every week to make sure that the infection was clearing in the right way. I had further ultrasound scans. I had biopsies done to make sure the infection and the fluids and the markers were all going down. And 3 months later, my son, it might have been about 2.5. So I think he was about 10 weeks old. We got discharged from the hospital completely. So we didn't need to be seen as an outpatient. And then the day we got discharged, I then came down with COVID because my body and the immune system was just completely and utterly shot, basically. So I then had 10 days quarantining at home with COVID, and that didn't help my mental health. And then we had about a week of feeling normal, and then I got norovirus. So the first 12 weeks of my son's life were just ill, basically. And from those sort of subsequent illnesses that must have come about because our immune systems were so low, was the fact that I had an amazing mental health worker volunteer who would come in every couple of weeks just to see how I'm doing, and she recognized that actually the illness of COVID and norovirus sort of knocked me over the edge, and they were really bringing up PTSD in me, and I was referred to a mental health team that were attached to the birthing unit, and I went for trauma therapy, which was incredible, basically. Rex is my first child. I've since lost a pregnancy, and at 15 weeks we lost the pregnancy. So that was 6 months ago. So it's still, it's tough. It's tough because when I hit that pregnancy, when I became pregnant in July last year, I was nervous for everything anyway. I had anxiety because of our previous experience. But the midwifery team were great, and I had been assured that I could be referred to the Lotus team, which was the team that look after maternal mental health and mothers who've had tricky experiences in the past. And then unfortunately, when we got to our scan, we'd lost the pregnancy. Trust your gut. If you know something's not quite right and you're not quite you, speak to somebody about it. You may not want to go down therapy or trauma therapy, or, it might just be a friend. Just speak to somebody, because talking really, really helps. And I think it affects a lot of people more than you realize. And I think, at that time, I probably didn't recognize I had those, apart from the PTSD. I remember even saying to friends, oh, I'm fine now. I'm fine, 6 weeks or 7 weeks. And then actually, I really wasn't. The worst was still yet to come mentally, effectively. And so, just listen to those around you. If they're concerned for you, just take it on board. They're only there to help. They're only there looking out for you. And if you don't feel you, then make those steps to make you feel like you again, basically. It doesn't matter how a baby is fed, just so long as if you are in the best mindset you possibly can be, because having a newborn is the most difficult thing you can possibly do. And you need to weather those sleepless nights, the adjustment in your schedule, the adjustment with your relationship with your partner. You have to weather all of that together, dealing with whatever might arise, poorly babies, you being poorly. And so really do what you think is best for your own mental health. I think the biggest thing I've learned ever since having a child and being in a situation where your life is sort of, you're being taken ill very poorly and you start to sort of put things in perspective, is you've got to trust your gut. And I think that initial phone call that we made to the ward, is this normal that the nipples are cracked? And they went, oh yeah, it's fine, just feed through it. I think deep down, I knew it wasn't normal. I didn't want my son to be drinking blood from my nipples. And so I did. I tried to push through it. And then I said, actually, can't do this. Let's start again tomorrow. And we gave him some formula. I just think the biggest takeaway is trust your gut. Whether healthcare professionals are saying one thing or another, you've really got to push for what you think is happening, because ultimately you're the one that's in charge of your body and you know really what's going on deep down. I really do think that actually they should be informing mothers to be and fathers to be of sepsis in those antenatal groups.